The year was 2017, a time when the world was loud, but for 9 souls in Japan, the silence was deafening. Imagine, if you will, the glow of a smartphone screen in a dark room, the only source of light for a lonely heart beating in the vast, concrete sprawl of Tokyo and its neighboring prefectures. In this modern age, we don't scream into the void, we type it. We cast our pain into the digital ocean, hoping someone, anyone, will see the ripples. And in the late summer of that year, something did see them. Something hungry. You see, in Japan, there is a hidden world beneath the polite surface, a digital underbelly where the desperate congregate. They used hashtags like secret handshakes, hashtag suicide recruitment, hashtag wantedy, hashtag killing myself. These weren't just words. They were cries for help from the very young, some as tender as 15 years old, others in their early 20s, drifting through life like ghosts before they were even dead. They were looking for a connection, a kindred spirit who understood the heaviness in their chests that no doctor or parent could see. They wanted to vanish, but they were terrified to go alone. And then a notification would ping, a soft, digital chime that sounded like salvation. Enter the spider. On the other side of the screen sat a man, ordinary in every way to the naked eye, tapping away in a small apartment in Zama, Kanagawa Prefecture. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a neighbor, a worker, a nobody. But online, he wore a mask crafted with terrifying precision. He went by names like Hanging Pro, a handle that chilled the blood if you thought about it too long. But to the desperate, it sounded like expertise. It sounded like a steady hand. He whispered through direct messages, his words dripping with a sickly sweet empathy. "I can help you," he would type. "I am a professional. Let's die together." He didn't hunt with a knife or a gun. He hunted with kindness. He told these fragile young women exactly what they needed to. Here, he validated their pain. He agreed that the world was too cruel, and he offered them the one thing they couldn't find anywhere else, a partner in the end. He crafted a persona of a gentle guide, someone who had the knowledge and the means to end their suffering painlessly. He was the soft voice in the dark, the hand reaching out when everyone else had turned away. But it was a lie, a meticulously constructed, cold-blooded lie. The trap was set in Zama, in a nondescript loft-style apartment that looked just like thousands of others. Wooden floors, white walls, a small kitchenette. The perfect camouflage for a house of horrors. He lured them in, one by one, convincing them to travel to him, to leave their safety behind, to step into his web. Can you imagine the mix of fear and relief they must have felt as they boarded the trains? The train wheels clattering against the tracks, counting down the minutes to what they thought was peace, but was actually a descent into a hell far worse than the lives they were running from. He met them with a smile. He walked them to his door, and once that heavy metal door clicked shut, the digital facade crumbled. The kind stranger from Twitter evaporated, replaced by a predator with eyes void of any light. There was no suicide pact. There was no mercy. There was only him, and his insatiable greed for control, for money, and for the darkest desires of the human heart. The air in that apartment wasn't filled with the peace he promised. It was heavy with a stillness that was about to be shattered. The screens went black, the hashtags stopped updating, and the real horror, the kind that doesn't fit in 280 characters, began to unfold in the suffocating quiet of that Zama room. He had found his first victim, an acquaintance, a test run for the nightmare he was about to unleash upon the world. And the world, The world had no idea what was happening behind those curtains. Before he was the monster in the loft, he was just a shadow in the neon glare of Kabukicho. If you've never walked the streets of Shinjuku's red light district at night, it is a sensory overload of promise and decay. Lights flash, music thumps from basement clubs, and thousands of people move like a singular organism. In this chaotic ecosystem, Takahiro Shiraishi was a bottom feeder. He worked as a scout. His job wasn't to help people, it was to hunt them. He spent his nights prowling the crowded streets, scanning the faces of passing women, looking for the telltale signs of financial desperation or low self-esteem. His goal was simple and cold: convince these women to enter the sex industry. He learned the art of manipulation here, in the grime of the city. He learned that if you listen to someone complain, if you nod at the right times and offer a tissue for their tears, you can make them do almost anything. He honed a predator's instinct for spotting the weak link in a person's armor. He learned that human beings could be broken down into price tags. But he wasn't particularly good at it. He was mediocre, a small-time hustler who eventually got caught. In early 2017, the law caught up with him. He was arrested for violating the Employment Security Act, recruiting women for brothels. He stood before a judge, received a suspended sentence, and was thrown back out onto the street. This was the crucible. He was broke, humiliated, and angry. He was living with his parents, a grown man with nothing to show for his life but a criminal record. The scouting life was over, but the skills he had learned, the ability to charm, to lie, to exploit, were burning a hole in his pocket. He sat in his room, staring at his phone, and realized he had been fishing in the wrong pond. Why try to convince reluctant women to work in brothels when there was a sea of women online begging to disappear? He realized that the suicidal were the ultimate targets. They didn't need to be coerced. They were already walking toward the edge. He just needed to be the one to give them the final push. In August 2017, the plan solidified. He needed a slaughterhouse. He found a loft apartment in Zama, a quiet suburb about an hour from the noise of Tokyo. It was perfect, remote enough to be ignored, close enough to the train lines. But he had no money. The initial costs to rent an apartment in Japan are steep, requiring deposits and fees he simply didn't have. So, he did what he did best. He found a sponsor. He reconnected with a 21-year-old woman he had met during his scouting days. She was vulnerable, she trusted him, and perhaps she even harbored some affection for this quiet, intense man. He spun her a story, likely about a new life, a fresh start for them. She believed him. She transferred 510,000 yen, about $4,500, into his account. It was her life savings, handed over with a smile. With her money, he signed the lease. With her money, he bought the keys to his dungeon. They walked into that apartment together on a humid August day. It was empty, smelling of fresh paint and tatami. She probably looked around and saw a future. He looked around and saw a disposal site. The shift in him was absolute. He later admitted that he had no intention of living with her. She had served her purpose the moment the lease was signed. Now, she was just a loose end, a liability. She was the only person who knew where he was, the only one who could tie him to his past. The decision wasn't made in a fit of rage. It was a cold calculation. One evening, shortly after moving in, the pretense dropped. The nice guy scout vanished. He didn't want to pay her back. He didn't want her asking questions. He wanted the apartment, the money, and the silence. He attacked her. It was his first time crossing that final line, The first time his hands weren't just manipulating a mind, but extinguishing a life. He strangled her. The struggle in that empty, echoey room must have been terrifying. The realization of betrayal hitting her at the same moment the air left her lungs. He watched the light go out of the eyes of the woman who had just paid for the roof over his head. And as her body went limp on the floor of the apartment she had paid for, Takahiro Shiraishi didn't feel guilt. He felt a dark, intoxicating rush of power. He was no longer a failed scout. He was a master of life and death. But now he had a problem, a body, and he knew that to keep this new kingdom of his, he had to make sure she was never, ever found. The silence that followed that first murder was heavier than anything he had ever known. The woman, the one who had trusted him with her fortune and her future, lay still on the floor. Most men would have panicked. They would have fled the building, left the money, and run until their legs gave out. But Shiraishi stood there, breathing in the stale air of the closed room, and felt a cold pragmatism wash over him. He wasn't going to run. He had the apartment. He had the money. He just needed to get rid of the evidence. He sat down at his computer, the blue light illuminating a face that was devoid of panic. He opened a search engine. He didn't search for how to hide a body or flight to another country. He typed in something far more clinical, far more visceral. He began researching the anatomy of the human body. He needed to know how to take it apart. He read about joints, about the density of bone, about the weight of organs. It was like a student cramming for a biology exam. Only the subject was the woman lying a few feet away. The next day, he stepped out into the blinding August sun. He looked like any other young man running errands for a new home. He walked into a local hardware store, pushing a shopping cart down the aisles. To the other shoppers, he was invisible, just a guy in a t-shirt. But look at what he put in the cart. A saw with a jagged, hungry blade, a set of knives, plastic tarps, bottles of bleach, and then, the most chilling purchase of all, cat litter. Bags and bags of it. He didn't own a cat. He needed it to absorb the fluids, to mask the inevitable stench of decay that he knew was coming. He also bought large, sealable plastic storage bins, RV boxes, the kind families use for camping gear or winter clothes. He bought them in bulk. Back in the apartment, he turned the tiny bathroom into a slaughterhouse. He lined the walls with the plastic sheets, creating a kill room reminiscent of a fictional serial killer. But this was horrifyingly real. He dragged the body into the tub. What happened next in that cramped space is the stuff of nightmares. He found that the saw was loud, the sound of metal on bone echoing off the tile, threatening to alert the neighbors. He had to be careful. He had to be methodical. He realized that the flesh was the problem. It rotted, it smelled. So he began the grueling, grisly work of defleshing the bones, treating the human form like livestock. He worked for hours, sweating in the summer heat, covered in the blood of his benefactor. He separated the meat from the bone, disposing of the softer tissue in the trash as if it were kitchen scraps, mixed with the kitty litter to hide the smell. The bones, the heavy evidence that wouldn't burn or decompose quickly, he couldn't throw away. So, he placed them into the cooler boxes. He sealed the lids tight with duct tape. But there was one part he couldn't bring himself to destroy, or perhaps he feared that discarding it would lead to immediate identification if found. The head. He took the severed head of his first victim and placed it gently inside one of the coolers. He then stacked the cooler in the corner of the room. When he was done, he scrubbed the bathroom. He bleached the floors until the chemical sting burned his eyes. He sat back in the center of the room, surrounded by the smell of bleach and the faint, sweet underlying odor of death that the cat litter couldn't quite conquer. He looked at the cooler in the corner. He wasn't repulsed. He was emboldened. He had done the impossible. He had killed, he had cleaned, and he was still free. The apartment was no longer just a living space. It was a factory. And like any factory, it needed raw materials to keep running. He realized that the layout of the apartment, a loft style with a sleeping area above and the living space below, allowed him to coexist with his crimes. He could sleep in the loft, literally resting above the remains of his victims. He had the tools now. He had the method. The saw was cleaned and ready. The coolers were stacked and waiting. The empty boxes whispered to him, demanding to be filled. He turned back to his computer, to the glowing blue screen, and logged back into Twitter. The Hanging Pro was open for business. He became a chameleon of despair, a master actor on a stage built of pixels and pain. His modus operandi was terrifyingly simple, yet effective because it exploited the deepest, most primal fear of the suicidal, the fear of dying alone and in pain. He didn't just wait for messages. He hunted for them. He scoured the timelines for the hashtags. Hashtag I wanted it. Hashtag suicide recruitment. And when he found a target, he slid into their DMs with the casual confidence of a service provider. I can help you, he would type. I have the means. I have the knowledge. To some, he was the hanging professional, claiming he could tie the perfect knot that would bring instant, painless oblivion. To others, he was a fellow traveler, a broken soul who also wanted to leave this world. This was his most potent lie. Let's die together. It was the ultimate bait. It promised companionship in the void. It turned a terrifying, lonely act into a shared journey, a dark romance of sorts. He would gently probe them, asking questions that seemed like care, but were actually a predator's risk assessment. Have you told anyone where you are going? Are you truly alone? He was checking for loose ends. He was making sure that when they vanished, no one would know where to look. Once he had hooked them, they trusted him enough to agree to a meeting. He would summon them to Zama. Imagine the scene. A young woman, perhaps carrying a small bag with her last possessions, stepping off the train at Zama Station or nearby Suicidal Station. Her heart is pounding, a mix of dread and resolve. She scans the crowd, looking for the Hanging Pro, and she sees him. He looks normal, soft-spoken, unthreatening. He smiles, a shy, polite smile that puts her at ease. He leads her away from the safety of the public eye, guiding her through the mundane streets of the suburb. They walk past convenience stores, past families walking their dogs, past the banal rhythm of life that she has decided to leave behind. She has no idea that she is walking next to a reaper. They arrive at the apartment. He opens the door. After you. The moment that door clicked shut, the trap was sprung. The air inside was thick, perhaps heavy with the scent of air fresheners battling the underlying coppery tang he tried so hard to mask. He would offer them a drink, alcohol or tranquilizers, under the guise of calming the nerves before the final act. Relax, he'd say. We have time. He needed them pliant. He needed them off guard. And then, the mask fell. The horror of what happened next lies in the betrayal. These women had come seeking a peaceful end, a release from their suffering. Instead, they were met with brute violence. Shiraishi didn't want to die. He had no intention of killing himself. He wanted them. He wanted their bodies. He drugged them, and when they were groggy and defenseless, he assaulted them. The police reports are dry, but the reality is a nightmare of confusion and terror. The kind stranger pinned them down, his hands, not holding a rope for a pact, but tightening around their necks in a stranglehold. It is crucial to understand this. None of them wanted to die in that moment. This is the detail that haunts the case. When faced with the visceral, violent reality of a murder, the survival instinct kicked in. They struggled. They fought. The police later confirmed that marks on the bodies showed resistance. They had come to end their lives, yes, but not like this. Not as prey. Not as a toy for a sexual sadist. They wanted peace, and he gave them agony. After the light left their eyes, the pragmatism returned instantly. He stripped them of their possessions. He went through their bags, taking their cash, sometimes as little as 500 yen, about $4. A human life, extinguished for the price of a fast food meal. He took their phones, their ID cards, erasing their digital footprints just as he had erased their physical ones. And then, he dragged them to the bathroom, to the saw and the plastic sheets. The cycle began again. The noise of the saw, the bags of kitty litter, the sealing of the coolers. He was efficient now. He was getting faster. The room was filling up. The hanging pro was building a collection, and the internet was still teeming with lonely souls waiting for a reply. From late August to late October 2017, the apartment in Zama became a vortex. The time for hesitation was gone. Shiraishi had crossed the threshold of morality and entered a state of manic, industrial-scale slaughter. If the first murder was a crime of necessity, the subsequent ones were a compulsion. The pace was breathtakingly, horrifyingly fast. In just 2 months, he claimed 8 more lives. That averages out to roughly 1 human being every single week. The hanging pro was working overtime. His phone was a constant buzz of notifications, new targets, new schedules, new death dates. He was juggling multiple victims at once, chatting with one while the remains of another were still fresh in the bathroom. He had refined his process to a terrifying efficiency. Meet, lure, drug, kill, dismember, store. Repeat. It became a rhythm, a grisly routine that he performed with the detachment of a factory worker on an assembly line. Among the parade of young women, there was an anomaly, a man. He was the boyfriend of the very first victim. He had grown suspicious when his girlfriend vanished, and he started asking questions. He reached out to Shiraishi, not for death, but for answers. Shiraishi realized the danger immediately. This wasn't a sheep. This was a threat. So, he lured the man to the apartment under the pretense of sharing information about the missing woman. When the man arrived, perhaps hoping to find his love, he found only her killer. Shiraishi murdered him to silence him, proving that his motive wasn't just sexual or financial. It was self-preservation at any cost. This murder was different. It was the cold elimination of a loose end. Now, there were 2 ghosts in the room. And the room. God, the room. Imagine the atmosphere inside those 4 walls. The apartment was tiny, a standard Japanese one-room loft. As the weeks went by, the space began to fill up. He ran out of space in the first cooler, so he bought another. And another. And another. Eventually, there were 7 or 8 coolers and storage boxes stacked against the walls. Inside them sat the severed heads and bones of 9 people. He was literally building a wall of the dead. The sensory reality of his life during this period is almost impossible to comprehend. You cannot butcher 9 people in a small, unventilated space without consequences. The smell began to rise. It started as a faint, sickly sweet decay, then grew into a thick, cloying stench that clung to his clothes and hair. He tried to fight it. He kept the ventilation fan in the bathroom running 24/7. He poured more and more cat litter into the boxes until the floor was gritty with it. He sealed the boxes with layers of duct tape, trying to trap the gases of decomposition inside. But the smell leaked out. Neighbors walking past his door would wrinkle their noses. Some later reported smelling something like rotten cabbage or something dead, but in the anonymity of modern apartment living, no one knocked on the door. No one called the police. They just walked faster, attributing the stench to garbage or a negligent tenant. Shiraishi lived inside that stench. He slept in the loft bed, floating just a few feet above the coolers containing the heads of the women he had raped and strangled. He ate his meals there. He played video games there. He continued to chat with new girls on Twitter there. He had normalized the unimaginable. He wasn't haunted by the faces of the people he killed. He was inconvenienced by their physical mass. He had a growing problem of disposal. While he threw the flesh and organs out with the regular trash, disguising them under garbage to avoid detection by the sanitation workers, the bones were piling up. He couldn't just dump a skull in the community bin, so he kept them. He became a curator of a museum of horrors, surrounded by his trophies not out of pride, but out of a cowardly inability to get rid of them. By mid-October, the apartment was at capacity. The energy in the room was frantic. He was exhausted, likely running on adrenaline and the twisted high of his God complex. But the hunger didn't stop. He was still on Twitter. He was still hunting. And out there in the digital sea, a 23-year-old woman named Aiko Tamura was typing out her pain, unaware that she was about to become the final piece of his macabre collection. She was looking for someone to die with. He was looking for number 9. October 2017. The air was turning crisp, the leaves were changing, and in the bustling suburb of Hakioji, a family was about to be shattered. Aiko Tamura, a 23-year-old woman with a gentle face and a troubled heart, had vanished. To the outside world, she was just another face in the crowd, but to her brother, she was everything. She had been struggling, yes. She had been carrying a weight that seemed too heavy for her shoulders, amplified by the recent loss of their mother. But she was his sister. And when she stopped coming home, when her phone went straight to voicemail, when the silence stretched from hours into days, a cold knot of dread tightened in his stomach. The police, initially, were of little help. In Japan, adults have the right to disappear. It's called johatsu, evaporation. Unless there is clear evidence of a crime or a suicide note, the authorities are often hamstrung, unable to launch a full-scale manhunt for someone who might just want to be left alone. But the brother knew. He knew this wasn't a whim. He knew this wasn't a vacation. He felt it in his bones that something terrible had reached out and taken her. He didn't wait for the detectives to file paperwork. He became the detective. He knew that if his sister had gone somewhere, the answer wouldn't be in her empty room or on the streets of Hakioji. It would be in the digital world where she spent her darkest hours. He managed to gain access to her Twitter account. It was an invasion of privacy born of desperate love, a digital break-in to save a life. Trembling, he logged in. He saw the timeline, the cries for help, the hashtags that made his blood run cold. Hashtag I wanted E. Hashtag someone kill him. And then he opened the direct messages. What he found there was a transcript of seduction and death. He scrolled through the conversations, watching his sister's vulnerability being met with a predator's calculation. He saw the messages from a handle he had never seen before, Hanging Pro. He read the lies. He read the promises. I can help you. Let's do it together. Come to Zama. The timestamp on the last message was chillingly recent. It was the digital footprint of her abduction. The brother sat there, the glow of the screen illuminating his pale face, realizing that he was reading a script written by a monster. This hanging pro wasn't a friend. He wasn't a counselor. He was a black hole. The brother realized with a sickening clarity that his sister hadn't just walked away. She had been hunted. The conviction in the messages, the specific instructions on which train to take, the insistence on secrecy, it all pointed to something far more sinister than a suicide pact. He was terrified, but he was also furious. A righteous, burning anger took hold of him. He wouldn't let this hanging pro get away with it. He wouldn't let his sister be just another statistic. But he was smart. He knew that if he messaged this man screaming and threatening, the predator would spook. He would delete the account, destroy the evidence, and vanish back into the shadows. The brother needed to be cunning. He needed to play the game. He needed help. He couldn't do this alone. He started reaching out to others online, people who moved in those same dark circles, asking if anyone knew who this hanging pro was. He posted warnings. He asked for information. And in the vast, anonymous darkness of the internet, a spark of light appeared. A woman replied. She knew the handle. She knew the game. And more importantly, she was willing to help him. The brother had found the trail. He had the name, or at least the alias. He had the location, Zama. And he had a plan forming in his mind, a desperate, dangerous plan to turn the tables on the hunter. He wasn't just a grieving sibling anymore. He was the avenging angel for 9 lost souls, though he didn't yet know the scale of the horror he was walking toward. He stared at the last message his sister had sent, a message of trust to a man who deserved none, and he made a vow. He would find him. He would look him in the eye, and he would find out what happened to Aiko, no matter what nightmare awaited him at the end of the line. The brother held the phone like it was a live grenade. He had the connection. He had the suspect. But he knew that one wrong move would blow the entire operation. He realized that he, a furious, grieving man, was the wrong bait for this particular shark. Shiraishi hunted young, vulnerable women. He hunted the broken. If a man showed up, or if the tone was too aggressive, the hanging pro would simply ghost them, melting back into the digital ether to find a victim who wouldn't fight back. To catch a predator, they needed prey. The woman who had stepped forward to help, let's call her the decoy, was a study in courage. She wasn't a police officer. She was a civilian, a stranger who had heard the brother's plea and stepped into the line of fire. She agreed to play the part of the suicidal girl. It was a role that required her to inhabit a dark headspace, to type out words of despair that she didn't feel, all to lure a monster out of his cave. They crafted the messages together. She opened a fresh dialogue with Shiraishi. She used the keywords he sniffed around for: lonely, afraid, want to disappear. She played the part perfectly. I'm looking for someone to die with, she typed. I have no one. And in the dark apartment in Zama, amidst the stench of rotting bodies and the hum of the ventilation fan, Shiraishi's phone lit up. He saw the notification. He read the words. And his greed blinded him. He didn't see a trap. He saw victim number 10. He saw another 500 yen to be stolen, another body to be used, another conquest for his twisted ego. He replied almost immediately. I can help you, he wrote back. The same script. The same lies. I am a professional. Trust me. The cat and mouse game that ensued over the next few days was agonizing. The decoy had to maintain the facade of a terrified girl needing a savior, while Shiraishi pressed her for details. He asked about her financial situation. always the money. He asked if she had told anyone. He asked if she was alone. Every answer she gave was a carefully calculated lie designed to soothe his paranoia. She was feeding his confidence, making him believe he was in total control. Meanwhile, the brother took this entire transcript to the police. He walked into the station not with a vague suspicion, but with a smoking gun. He showed them the messages. He showed them the pattern. He connected the Hanging Pro account to the disappearance of his sister. The police, who are often slow to act on adult disappearances, saw the predatory nature of the conversation. They saw a man actively soliciting a suicide pact. The gears of the investigation finally caught. They realized this wasn't just a missing person case. They were dealing with a serial offender, though they still couldn't fathom the true scale of what was waiting in that apartment. The trap was set for October 31st, Halloween, a fitting date for a horror story to reach its climax. The decoy messaged Shiraishi one last time. She agreed to meet him. She told him she was ready. She would come to Zama. Shiraishi, emboldened by his streak of success, didn't hesitate. He gave her the instructions. Come to Zama Station. Don't tell anyone. I'll pick you up. He was arrogant now. He thought he was untouchable. He cleaned himself up, perhaps put on fresh clothes to mask the smell that clung to him, and prepared to walk out his door to collect his prize. He had no idea that the girl waiting for him was a phantom. He had no idea that the brother was watching. He had no idea that the station was about to be swarming with undercover officers. He thought he was going to guide another sheep to the slaughter. Instead, he was walking straight into the jaws of the wolf. The digital predator was about to be forced into the real world, where there is no block button, no delete key, and no escape. October 31st, 2017. Halloween. While the rest of Tokyo was preparing for costumes and parties, a grim task force was assembling in the quiet streets of Zama. The air was thick with tension, invisible to the passers-by, but suffocating for the men in plain clothes who dotted the area around the train station. They were the hunters now. They were looking for a ghost, a man who existed mostly in the blue light of Twitter DMs, a man who had promised death to so many. The trap had been baited. The message had been sent. Now they waited. The plan was delicate. If Shiraishi sensed even a tremor of danger, he could bolt. Or worse, he could barricade himself inside that apartment with whatever evidence or victims still remained. The police needed to identify him, track him, and corner him before he could react. The brother of the missing Aiko Tamura waited in the wings, his heart hammering against his ribs, a mixture of hope and nausea churning inside him. This was the man who had taken his sister. He was about to see his face. Then, movement. A young man appeared. He looked aggressively ordinary. He wasn't wearing a hockey mask or wielding a weapon. He was slight of build, with messy hair and the slump-shouldered posture of a guy who spent too much time online. He looked like a student, a convenience store clerk, a nobody. He was scanning the crowd, checking his phone, looking for this suicidal girl he had groomed for death. This was Takahiro Shiraishi. The monster of Zama was just a man in a t-shirt. The signal was given. The undercover officers moved with the fluid, practiced grace of a pack of wolves cutting a straggler from the herd. They didn't tackle him in the street. They didn't draw guns and scream. That's not how it works in Japan. It was quieter, more suffocating. They shadowed him. They watched him return to the apartment building, that nondescript two-story structure with the loft apartments. They watched him climb the stairs to the second floor. They watched the door to room 205 close behind him. Now they had him. He was in the box. Two investigators approached the door. The metal walkway rang slightly under their shoes, a sound that must have echoed like thunder to the man inside, though he had no idea they were coming. Inside, Shiraishi was likely confused. Where was the girl? Why hadn't she shown up? He was probably checking his phone, annoyed that his schedule had been disrupted, unaware that his entire world was about to implode. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was sharp, authoritative. It shattered the silence of the afternoon. Inside the apartment, Shiraishi froze. He wasn't expecting guests. He never had guests, only victims. He might have glanced at the coolers stacked against the wall, those silent, taped-up sentinels of his crimes. Did he feel a flicker of panic? Or was he so lost in his own delusions of omnipotence that he thought he could talk his way out of this too? He walked to the door. He unlocked it. He opened it just a crack, peering out with the guarded suspicion of a recluse. Yes, standing there were the detectives. They didn't look like customers. They showed their badges, the gold glinting in the hallway light. "We are investigating a missing person case," one of them said, his voice level but hard as iron. "A woman named Aiko Tamura. We have information that links her to this address." Shiraishi stood in the doorway, blocking the view inside. This was the precipice. One word, one slip, and he was done. But he didn't slam the door. He didn't run. He looked at them with those dead, shark-like eyes. He was calculating. He was assessing. But the police weren't asking for permission anymore. They could smell it now. The faint, escaping odor of the cat litter and what lay beneath it, drifting out past him into the fresh air. It was the scent of guilt. "May we come in?" It wasn't really a question. The weight of the law pressed against the door. Shiraishi stepped back. He surrendered the threshold. And as the officers stepped into the Genkan, the small entryway where you take off your shoes, they were leaving the civilized world behind and stepping into a tomb. The door clicked shut behind them, sealing the three of them inside the slaughterhouse. The hunt was over. The nightmare of discovery was about to begin. The apartment was small, shockingly small. It was a standard Japanese one-room, measuring roughly 13.5 square meters. A space designed for a single person's simple life. A bed, a small fridge, a television. But as the officers stepped past the Genkan and into the main living area, the air changed. It wasn't just the smell anymore. It was the density of the room. The space felt occupied, crowded, though Shiraishi was the only one standing there. The officers' eyes darted around, assessing threats, looking for the missing girl. They saw the clutter of daily life mixed with the tools of a madman. There were bags of cat litter piled up, too many for a pet owner, and Shiraishi had no pets. There were zip ties. There was a saw. And then there were the boxes. 3 large camping coolers and 5 storage containers stacked against the wall, taking up a significant portion of the floor space. They sat there, innocuous plastic shells taped shut with layers of duct tape, silent monoliths in the cramped room. The lead officer turned to Shiraishi. The tension was razor-wire tight. The question was simple, direct, aimed at the disappearance of Aiko Tamura. "Where is she?" Shiraishi didn't flinch. He didn't break down sobbing. He didn't invent a story about her running away or leaving hours ago. He stood there with a chilling, dead-eyed calm, a man who had moved beyond the need for lies because the truth was far more powerful. He raised a hand and pointed a finger toward the stack of containers in the corner. "In the cooler," he said softly. "The contents are true." The officers froze. The words hung in the air, heavy and impossible. "In the cooler." One of the detectives moved toward the stack. He reached for the top box. The sound of the duct tape peeling away was a tearing screech in the silent room. He lifted the lid. Inside, a layer of white cat litter granules covered the bottom, a desperate, gritty attempt to mask the reality below. But the litter couldn't hide everything. The officer sifted through it, and his hand brushed against something cold, something that shouldn't have been there. He brushed the granules aside and uncovered a human head. It was severed, pale, and preserved in the horrifying tomb of plastic and clay. The shock was physical. Even hardened detectives, men who had seen death in its many forms, recoiled. The room seemed to spin, but the nightmare was just beginning. "Whose is this?" the officer demanded, his voice tight with revulsion. "I don't know," Shiraishi replied. And he didn't. He had killed so many, so fast, that they had become anonymous to him. He knew them by their Twitter handles, not their faces. The officers looked at the other boxes. The realization hit them like a physical blow. If there was one, were there others? They began to open them, one by one. The sound of tape tearing, the lid lifting, the smell of decay and chemicals billowing out. Box 2. Another head. Box 3. Another. The counting began, a macabre tally that defied all logic. In that tiny room, where Shiraishi slept and ate, the police uncovered the severed heads of 9 people, 8 women and 1 man. Along with the heads, they found approximately 240 bone fragments, arms, legs, ribs, stripped of their flesh and packed like discarded refuse. The flesh and organs were gone, flushed away or thrown out with the trash, but the hard evidence, the parts he couldn't destroy, were all here. He had been living in a mausoleum. The sheer scale of the atrocity was overwhelming. This wasn't a crime scene. It was a graveyard. The apartment contained the remains of 9 lives extinguished in just 2 months. The officers were standing in the middle of one of the most horrific serial murder cases in Japanese history. The cramped walls seemed to close in, screaming with the silent agony of the victims who had died right where the officers were standing. Shiraishi stood amidst the chaos he had created, watching the police unravel his dark work. He was arrested on the spot, initially on the charge of abandoning a body, a technicality to hold him while the true horror was processed. As they handcuffed him and led him out of the room, past the coolers, past the saw, past the evidence of his butchery, the hanging pro didn't look like a monster. He looked like a void. He had turned a 13-square-meter room into hell on earth. And when asked why he hadn't disposed of the heads, his answer was as pragmatic as it was terrifying. "I was afraid I would get caught if I threw them away." The door to room 205 was sealed, but the story inside was about to spill out and horrify the world. The Twitter killer had been caught, but the question remained: what kind of justice could possibly pay for 9 souls? The discovery of the 9 heads was not the end of the horror. It was merely the beginning of the legal and psychological autopsy that followed. Takahiro Shiraishi was taken into custody, and unlike many criminals who cling to denial or weave intricate webs of insanity, he spoke with a terrifying, lucid candor. He sat in the interrogation room, a young man with a soft voice, and dismantled the entire suicide pact myth that had surrounded the case. "I didn't want to die," he told investigators. "I wanted their money. I wanted to satisfy my sexual desires." The brutality of his confession lay in its simplicity. There was no grand philosophy, no misunderstood artist. He was a predator who had found a vulnerability in the human code, loneliness, and exploited it for cash and lust. He admitted that the suicide recruitment, was purely a business model. He detailed how he had learned that the most effective way to lure a victim was to agree with their darkest thoughts, to validate their pain, and then, in their moment of greatest weakness, to strike. He even admitted to the specific details of the murders, correcting the police when they got the timeline wrong. He wanted the credit. The trial began in September 2020, 3 years after the arrest. The courtroom was packed, the air heavy with the grief of 9 families who had waited too long for this day. Shiraishi's defense team, desperate to save his life, tried to play the only card they had: murder with consent. In Japan, killing someone who asks to be killed carries a significantly lighter sentence than standard murder. The lawyers argued that since these victims had come to Zama to die, Shiraishi had merely assisted them. They painted a picture of a tragic, consensual end. But Shiraishi, sitting in the defendant's chair, would have none of it. In a stunning move that sabotaged his own defense, he took the stand and looked the jury in the eye. None of them agreed to die, he stated flatly. They resisted. They fought. He described the struggles, the fear, the sounds of the dying. He effectively signed his own death warrant because he refused to let his victims be remembered as people who gave up. He wanted it known that he had taken their lives, not received them. On December 15, 2020, the judge delivered the verdict. The consent argument was rejected entirely. The court found him guilty of 9 counts of murder, robbery, and rape. The sentence was death. When asked if he had any final words or if he wanted to appeal, Shiraishi remained indifferent. "I have no desire to fight this," he said. In January 2021, he formally withdrew his lawyer's appeal, finalizing the sentence. He was moved to the Tokyo detention house to await his turn at the gallows. In Japan, the death penalty is a shroud of secrecy. Inmates live in solitary confinement for years, never knowing when their time will come. They are notified only on the morning of the execution, just an hour or two before it happens. For Shiraishi, that morning came on Friday, June 27, 2025. The guard's footsteps stopped at his cell door. There was no time for goodbyes. There was no time for fear to truly set in. He was led to the execution chamber, a sterile, church-like room with a trapdoor in the center of the floor. There were no cameras, no media circus, just the chaplain, the officials, and the rope. At the age of 34, the man who had preyed on the silence of the internet was silenced by the state. The trapdoor opened, and the Twitter killer fell into the void he had so often promised to others. Justice Minister Keisuke Suzuki announced the execution later that day, stating that Shiraishi's crimes were extremely selfish and caused great shock to society. But for the families, the hanging was just a punctuation mark on a sentence of grief that would never end. The account was closed, the handle was deactivated, but the digital ghosts of Zama remain. A chilling reminder that on the internet, you never truly know who is listening in the dark.